Thank you, Michael, very much. It's really a pleasure to be able to kick things off with this terrific first panel on RAWLS and the project of modern political philosophy. We have three extraordinary speakers who are going to be thinking with you through the question of how we should conceptualize the RAWLSian project, both at its inception historically and as we move forward. Since you have wonderfully detailed biographies of the three speakers, I'm going to introduce them very briefly, and they'll speak in the order that I introduced them. First of all, we're delighted to have with us Leif Wenar, who is Professor of Philosophy and Law at University College London, a Stanford undergraduate but a Harvard PhD, who studied with John Rawls, among other luminaries in our philosophy department, and has written extensively on issues in political philosophy, focusing most recently on the normative dimensions of the petro-economy, but also looking at questions having to do with property rights and liberal rights more broadly. So it's a pleasure to have him. Next, we have Katrina Forrester, Kenzie is actually going to go second. That's right. Sorry? Oh, it is Katrina. Okay. My colleague Katrina Forrester, who teaches in the government department here at Harvard, and comes to us via Cambridge, UK, and has just completed an important book, In the Shadow of Justice, on the formation of mid-20th century American liberal political philosophy. And lastly, Kenzie Bach, a very highly decorated undergraduate member of Harvard College, who also went to Cambridge on a Marshall Scholarship, where she completed a PhD and is preparing a book manuscript that will give us the first proper intellectual biography of the young Rawls. So it's a great pleasure to have all of them, and can I introduce Professor Wenar?
Hello, it's great to see so many friends. I'd like to thank the Secura Foundation and Michael Rosen and Danielle Allen and the rest of the amazing Harvard Brain Trust that was just described for putting together this conference on the work of John Rawls, whose work we are just beginning to understand. Since all the historians on the panel are both first-rate and, I think, double Cantabrigians, I'm going to leave the past to them. And instead, I'd like to muse with you on the future of the project of modern political philosophy, because 2021 is not only the centenary of Rawls' birth, it is the 50th anniversary of the publication of Theory of Justice, and as you may know, preparations are well underway for a conference on the 50th anniversary. And that got me thinking about the distant future. What about the centenary of Theory of Justice? What parts of justice's fairness do you think may have spread beyond the academy into American public political culture in 2071? Now, this question of the public culture is vital because justice's fairness, as you know, is distinctive in that it can't succeed in its own terms unless it's understood by ordinary Americans. In what Rawls calls the third level of the full publicity condition, citizens of a well-ordered society know the full justification of justice's fairness, or at least the justification is available to all citizens who take an interest in politics. This means that for America to become a well-ordered society, the justification of justice's fairness would have to be accessible enough, say, for a high school civics teacher to teach it in civics class, for a president to refer to it in a State of the Union address, for an Uber driver to explain it to distant visitors should the conversation turn to politics during the drive-in from the airport. What in justice's fairness can become part of America's public political culture like that? Let's get an example of what we're looking for, an example of a public touchstone that meets RAWLS'S publicity condition right now. Think perhaps about how Americans would justify religious freedom to each other. We might say, America has religious freedom because we trust each other to make up our own minds about God and faith. Now, that's a deep idea. It's an idea that justice could spell out at length in a decision. And it's also an accessible idea that Americans today can offer to each other. So, what ideas in RAWLS'S might become a political touchstone like that? Well, we might think that the veil of ignorance has a shot. The veil of ignorance is a handy test for the fairness of public policies. Would you support tax cuts if you didn't know your income? Would you support equal pay if you didn't know your gender, and so on? The veil of ignorance is likely what our students remember a year after RAWLS'S class. And I take it as a promising sign for its chances in public culture that it actually has been used to justify public policy by a presidential staffer during the now long and sorely missed presidential administration of Jed Bartlett. What about the full original position? It seems to me that the full original position has no chance to become part of American public culture. By the full original position, I mean this, as we know it from the restatement. Now, there's been many criticisms of that argument regarding the thickness of the veil or the decision-theoretic reasoning of the parties and so on. What especially gives me pause is that I suspect that RAWLS'S himself lost confidence that the original position could meet his own publicity conditions. For instance, in Theory of Justice, RAWLS'S said that the original position should be built from widely accepted but weak premises. But by the time of the restatement, he's saying that even the argument for the basic liberties rests on premises that are highly controversial. More, the arguments for the difference principle in the restatement hardly use original position reasoning at all. And by the time we get to the law of peoples, the original position is barely sketched in, and the arguments even less. Beyond RAWLS'S own doubts, we can predict that the original position will not enter the public culture because its form of reasoning is not widely accessible. Now, of course, this technical argument is too complex for public use, and it may not have escaped your attention that even some philosophy PhDs can get it wrong. But even if we distill the arguments to their simplest, they still don't fit into the political discourse of a democratic society. Here, for example, is the original position argument for religious freedom distilled to its simplest. If we Americans knew nothing about our form of government and nothing about our own religions, we'd all rationally agree to religious liberty. It seems to me beyond comprehension that anything like that could become a public justification in America. It's hard to imagine a judge stating it in an opinion, or a candidate saying it on the stump, or a teacher teaching it in civics class. This kind of reasoning just doesn't happen anywhere in American politics, or in fact in the politics of any democratic society that we know. RAWLS'S says that justice's fairness should be political, not metaphysical. I think we must conclude that the original position is theoretical, not accessible. Now, I say that with real regret. I've been studying the original position since I wrote my undergraduate thesis on it with Stuart Hampshire. I've been studying this argument for quite some time. Yet, I've eventually concluded that the original position is a hothouse flower which has grown luxuriously within the academy, but which can't take root in the soil of American democratic culture. I say that with regret, but also with optimism and even with a certain excitement. Because there are ideas in RAWLS that could spread widely and grow deeply in America's public culture, which our attention to the original position has left undeveloped, and which the next era of RAWLS scholarship could cultivate. RAWLS's work sets out a vision of social relations that civics teachers and judges and Uber drivers could offer as public justifications in a future, well-ordered American society. I'm going to describe RAWLS's model of social relations toward the end, and first, I'll motivate it by showing the kinds of real political problems RAWLS's model is meant to solve. We scholars have perhaps overstudied the prescriptions that RAWLS wrote without attending to the social ills that he meant to treat. RAWLS was a social theorist in the tradition of Rousseau, Marx, and Nietzsche. And starting with his diagnoses of social disorders not only gives us a RAWLS for our troubled times, it shows why his vision of social relations may be just what this country needs next. Here's an overview of the rest of the talk. I'll first develop RAWLS's critique of the ideal type of America's current distributive system, which is meritocracy. RAWLS thought that meritocracy can lead to a politics of resentment and to what he called hostile outbreaks of envy, which we see in American politics around us now. RAWLS also thought that these politics of resentment can lead to a destructive racial nationalism that might endanger constitutional government itself. RAWLS's analyses of these instabilities urges us to move beyond meritocracy for the sake of both justice and prudence. And RAWLS then offers a model that reorders and well-orders society, a society of self-respect. As we turn to RAWLS's critique of meritocracy, let me first note that RAWLS did not see distributions of social goods as important in themselves. Unlike some philosophers today, RAWLS didn't think that realizing some pattern of primary goods would light up a sign flashing justice over a country like a jackpot sign lights up over a slot machine. Rather, RAWLS was always looking through distributions to see how they affect citizen self-conceptions and their relations. The social system shapes the wants and the aspirations that its citizens come to have. It determines in part the sort of persons they want to be, as well as the sort of persons that they are. Above all, RAWLS was concerned about how distributions affect self-respect, how the social system affects citizens' sense of their own value. With self-respect, a person has a secure conviction that his plan of life is worth carrying out. Without it, nothing may seem worth doing. All desire and activity become empty and vain, and we sink into apathy and cynicism. Self-respect will drive RAWLS's critique of meritocracy, which is the ideal type of the American socioeconomic system. The American meritocratic model says that if one has talent and works hard, one will win the competition for money and political power. As we know, America is actually very far from being a meritocracy. But let's leave that aside. Even if America cleaned itself up and became a real meritocracy, RAWLS would have grave concerns because meritocracy leads to what we can call a politics of resentment. In a meritocracy, RAWLS says, there exists a marked disparity between the upper and lower classes in both the means of life and the rights and privileges of organizational authority. The culture of the poor strata is impoverished, while that of the governing technocratic elite is securely based on the service of the national ends of power and wealth. Worse, the American meritocracy is a status competition for money and power as positional goods, where one's level of public esteem turns on whether one has more or less than others. Our status competition for positional goods is a great misfortune, Rawls says, in this very Rousseauian passage. Everyone cannot have the highest status, and to improve one person's position is to lower that of someone else. Social cooperation to increase the conditions of self-respect is impossible. The means of status, so to speak, are fixed, and each man's gain is another's loss. Persons are set at odds with one another in the pursuit of their self-esteem. In this status-competitive society, the lower classes are not only trapped in an impoverished culture, they are constantly reminded of their inferiority by the glaring disparities in wealth. More, if good, stable jobs become scarcer, as in America today, a meritocracy becomes even worse. Lacking a sense of long-term security and the opportunity for meaningful work and occupation is not only destructive of citizens' self-respect, but of their sense that they are members of a society and not simply caught in it. This leads to self-hatred, bitterness, and resentment. Finally, in a meritocracy, the losers in the struggle for money and power see no way out through politics. Having been effectively prevented by their lack of means for exercising their fair degree of political influence, they withdraw into apathy and resentment. Meritocracy leads to a politics of resentment. Resentment in lower classes who cannot see the system as built for them, and who struggle to find self-respect in their constitutional identities as citizens. I'll be applying RAWLS'S analysis of the politics of resentment to America's white working class today. And let me say this is only going to be part of a complex reality. And let me especially emphasize that this analysis is not meant to apply to communities of people of color, where today's politics will have entirely different dynamics. Now, Rawls is concerned that a politics of resentment may lead to political instability, which might at first seem surprising. After all, America's meritocratic status hierarchy was stable for years, not least because the lower class's perception of their own political impotence helped to assure that the hierarchy continued undisturbed. However, Rawls writes that there may come episodes where some in the lower classes overcome their impotence and where resentment erupts into public life. These episodes are what Rawls calls hostile outbreaks of envy. He writes, there are three conditions that encourage hostile outbreaks of envy. First, persons lack a sure confidence in their own value and in their ability to do anything worthwhile. Second, many occasions arise when this psychological condition is experienced as painful and humiliating. The less fortunate are therefore often forcefully reminded of their situation, sometimes leading them to an even lower estimation of themselves and their mode of living. And third, they see their social position as allowing no constructive alternative to opposing the favored circumstances of the more advantaged. To alleviate their feelings of anguish and inferiority, they believe they have no choice but to impose a loss on those better placed, even at some cost to themselves. Rawls would see hostile outbreaks of envy in recent American politics, as in the 2016 election, where, as it said, many in the white working class voted with their middle fingers. And the mention of the white working class brings in a further quite dangerous potential to the politics of resentment. And here I'm drawing on a fine article by Paul Weithman. Those who cannot find self-respect in their constitutional identities may turn ever more to race and nation as sources of self-esteem. A resentful rise of racial nationalism is what Rawls thought happened in Weimar Germany. During Weimar, ordinary Germans, having suffered the humiliating end of World War I and the economic hardship of the 1920s, found themselves ruled by an indifferent, power-hungry elite. So they turned ever more to their national and racial identities as the main source of their self-esteem. We can hear Rawls speaking of Germany when he writes of a people inflamed by what Rousseau diagnosed as arrogant or wounded pride, or by lack of due self-respect. German political passions were then captured by a charismatic nativist who dismantled the country's remaining liberal institutions and who then launched a racial nationalist war that destabilized the entire global order. Let me summarize the politics of resentment before moving on. The analysis centers on a social class that has little hope in succeeding in a decisive status competition for money and political power. The members of this class feel dominated by a haughty political elite. So, when given an opportunity, they may support political actions that make themselves worse off, so long as they can also bring down those elites who are the objects of their intense resentment. Since they can gain so little self-respect from their constitutional identities as citizens, they may turn ever more to race and nation as sources of self-esteem. If this resentful class is powerful enough, it can seriously damage whatever liberal institutions exist, and if it becomes very powerful, it can even destroy the Constitution altogether. If Rawls were with us today, he would be distraught at all of the awful injustices we see flowing from America's politics of resentment. And of course, he would be extremely disturbed by today's racist white nationalism. Yet I believe Rawls would also remind us that resentment itself flows from injustice, that some of the resentment around us is the product of a meritocratic system that runs status competitions that many millions must lose, and in losing, lose their allegiance to the system as a whole. The instability that we see today is always latent in any meritocracy. Let me emphasize that point by noticing that many today are hoping that the white working class will eventually be overwhelmed by America's demographics and so will no longer be able to cause so much trouble. Yet if Rawls is right, the politics of resentment are built in to every meritocratic system. And so today's troubles may recur with tomorrow's demographics, driven by whatever social groups lose out in the status competition for positional goods, and so for public esteem. And now for the good news. Rawls built his model of a just society to affirm the self-respect of each citizen. Justice as fairness offers an attractive and accessible alternative to meritocracy that will keep the politics of resentment from getting started. We can call Rawls's vision a society of self-respect. Let's go back to the beginning, to Rawls's publicity requirement and to public accessibility. What ideas in justice as fairness could become a touchstone for public justification by 2071? We're looking for an organizing rationale for the two principles that civics teachers and politicians and a diversity of Americans could use in explaining their society to one another. It seems to me that self-respect is the touchstone. In a future America well ordered by RAWLS'S two principles, Americans could say to each other, our country is built for everyone. Our laws affirm the value of each citizen regardless of their religion, race, gender, class of origin, or inborn abilities. In this country, everyone can have self-respect. Just as RAWLS'S diagnosis of the politics of resentment are essentially Rousseauian, so his solution to the problem of resentment is also Rousseauian. For both Rawls and Rousseau, the solution to status competition over positional goods is to secure the self-worth of all through equality, especially equality in the fundamental role of citizenship. Equality is the only relation that can tame the human desire for ever more positional goods. And as Rawls says, in a well-ordered society, self-respect is secured by the public affirmation of the status of equal citizenship for all. The public rules of a well-ordered society proclaim the equal worth of all citizens. The institutions of a well-ordered society publicly support respect for all citizens throughout their daily lived experience, in their faith, in their work, in their communities, and in their participation in public affairs. Let's go quickly through Rawls's two principles to see how they support self-respect, drawing on some less commonly cited parts of Rawls's texts. Rawls's first principle supports every citizen's self-respect by securing the equal basic rights and liberties. The first principle confirms existing American rationales for those rights and liberties, such as the ones we met earlier. America has religious freedom because we trust each other to make up our own minds about God and faith. The self-respect of each citizen is even more vividly affirmed in the socioeconomic dimensions of justice as fairness that replace meritocracy. For example, the fair value of the political liberties gives all citizens roughly equal chances to influence politics. Rawls says, equal political liberty, when assured its fair value, is bound to have a profound effect on the moral quality of civic life. The public will to consult and take everyone's beliefs and interests into account lays the foundation for civic friendship and shapes the ethos of public culture and enhances the self-esteem and the sense of political competence of the average citizen. Fair equality of opportunity gives everyone a chance for work that suits their talents, regardless of their class background. And Rawls says that the rewards of work are then not only certain external rewards of office, such as wealth and privilege, but the realization of the self, which comes from a skillful and devoted exercise of social duties, one of the main forms of human good. As for the difference principle, it contrasts most markedly with meritocracy, where the less advantaged are told that they are losers in a competition based on talent and effort. With the difference principle, the less advantaged citizens know that the economy is also built for them, with the equal value of their lives in mind. The difference principle transforms the aims of society in fundamental respects. The confident sense of their own worth should be sought for the least favored, and this limits the form of hierarchy and the degrees of inequality that justice permits. Thus, for example, resources for education are not to be allotted solely according to their economic return, but also according to their worth in enriching the personal and social life of citizens, including here the less favored. Now, a meritocrat might look at Rawls's society of self-respect and object that its economy will be less competitive, and so it will grow less quickly. To this objection, Rawls will reply that the thought that real savings and economic growth are to go on indefinitely upward and onwards with no specified goal in sight is the idea of the business class of a capitalist society. In other words, endless growth is mere bourgeois ideology. To achieve a just and good society, Rawls says, great wealth is not necessary. In fact, beyond some point, it is more likely to be a positive hindrance, a meaningless distraction at best, if not a temptation to indulgence and emptiness. Who said Rawls can't write? That is terrific. Let me offer two further passages that illuminate how a well-ordered society supports every citizen's need for social status. The first passage starts out, what men want. What men want is meaningful work in free association with others. These associations regulating their relations to one another within a framework of just basic institutions. Therefore, in a well-ordered society, the need for status is met by the public recognition of just institutions, together with the full and diverse internal life of the many free communities of interest that the equal liberties allow. The basis for self-respect in a just society is not then one's income share, but the publicly affirmed distribution of fundamental rights and liberties. If America became a well-ordered society, the politics of resentment that characterize a meritocracy would not get started. All Americans can then see how their institutions are good for them, and they could say to each other, our country is built for everyone. In this country, everyone can have self-respect. Now let me finish with a thought that you might already be having, which is that for America to transform into a society of self-respect, Americans would need to have quite different attitudes towards each other than they do now. Americans would need a much deeper sense of social unity, a deeper willingness, as Rawls says, to share each other's fate, regardless of everything that makes them different from each other. For America to become a society of self-respect, citizens would need to want to share each other's fate more profoundly than they do now, regardless of religion and race and class, of origin and natural talents. Most Americans don't feel that way about each other now. Most Americans adhere to meritocratic norms or rough and tumble ideals of personal self-reliance or hateful ideologies of difference. So it might seem unlikely now that Americans could come to want to share each other's fate at the deep level that Rawls describes. We're in a fight now. Even a truce is hard to see. Yet recall the dangers of a politic of resentment that Rawls has described, where citizens who lose in a competition for public esteem launch destabilizing attacks on overbearing elites, and who could even drive a racial nationalism that undermines the constitutional order with all the consequences for the great evils of human history. If Rawls were with us here, looking out over the politics of America today, I believe that he would say that sharing each other's fate is now our best hope. If Rawls were here, I believe he would say that Americans should now see a choice between falling apart and forging a deeper union. Thank you.
So, hello. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to have the chance to speak with you all at such an exciting event. And thank you to Michael Rosen and to the organisers and sponsors for inviting me to be here. So I want to start off my talk today with two views of the history of political thought since the Second World War. The first view is a familiar one to political philosophers and political theorists. Let's call it the founding story of modern political philosophy. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the story goes, philosophers were unable to think about justice and utopia. Political theory was declared to be dead, and that all changed with Rawls. The publication of A Theory of Justice in 1971 marked the date of the major philosophical event of 20th century liberalism. Here we see a philosophical success story of political philosophy's mid-century death and revival, and its transformation through the rise of Rawlsian liberalism. Now, the second view is also a familiar one, but of a different kind. It's part of a broader story told by historians, sociologists, political economists, and one given increasing credibility since the financial crisis of 2007-8. And Michael Rosen mentioned some of this in his opening comments. It has become hard, I think, in recent years to ignore that the publication of Rawls's theory coincides with the major seismic events of post-war order. As many have argued, the 1970s marked the collapse of the social democratic liberalism that surged to dominance after the war, enabled by the concrete political and economic successes of capitalist welfare states. So in these years, the 1970s, forms of libertarianism and neoliberalism gained ground, ideas about the public interest were overturned, and ideas of the common good fractured. How do we bring these two stories together? So one powerful suggestion is to see Rawls's theory as hailing from a bygone era, the last gasp of a dying ideology. Against the backdrop of the broader transformation of social liberalism, the publication of Rawls's theory, that great philosophical defense of the welfare state, looks to have come on the eve of its crisis. Now, in my work on the history of liberal egalitarianism, I want to suggest a different way to bring these two stories together, the story of the death and revival of political philosophy on the one hand, and the stabilization and collapse of the post-war order on the other. The story of philosophy's death and revival is indeed a tale of philosophical success. I don't want to contest that, but underscore it. Rawls' role in that story is enormous, as this conference attests. He was largely responsible for the invention of a novel conceptual vocabulary and a philosophical language. But the success story is also a ghost story, in which Rawls's theory lived on as a spectral presence long after the conditions it described were gone. Now, what I will focus on today is showing that the liberalism that Rawls borrowed from has been misunderstood historically. The identity of the ghost is not as it seems. As will be well understood by this audience, despite its common misrepresentations, Rawls's theory was never straightforwardly a defense of the welfare state. But the precise origins of Rawls's political thought and his early statements about social, political, and economic life are not well known. I want to argue that these origins date to the Second World War, not the Great Society, and to a distinctive constellation of post-war liberalism and its afterlives, to a set of ideological battles that Rawls's own shadow has long hidden from view. Many of Rawls's key concepts were deliberate and self-conscious attempts to capture in his theory the world as he found it. They were products of effort and experimentation, which their naturalization as the standard framework of political philosophy has sometimes obscured. So today I'm going to try to reconstruct for you one small part of Rawls's early political thought, a set of ideas about government and the state that he developed in the early 1950s. And in doing so, I hope to make the case for the newest corner of what Brian Barry already in 1973 called the Rawls industry, the study of Rawls's project not only as political philosophy, but as part of the history of political thought, an undertaking made possible by the cataloguing of Rawls's papers, some of which, as you'll know, we can see exhibited today and tomorrow. So there are two prominent approaches already to the study of the so-called historical Rawls. One places Rawls into the history of political thought to connect his theory to particular traditions, Kantian, Hegelian, Lockean, or as Eric Nelson has recently argued, anti-Pelagian. Another restores his more immediate context, and my own focus is within this, on RAWLS'S political context, and on the broader politics of political philosophy as it came to dominance in his wake. So many historians of political thought view their project as one of recovery. My aim, by contrast, is to try to defamiliarize. And in what follows, I hope to provide you with some less familiar interpretations of familiar ideas in order to motivate the question of what such a history might tell us about RAWLS and after. And one thing I will suggest is that it tells us that we often underestimate the political distance traveled between RAWLS'S world and our own. Okay, so let me turn now to a remarkable pair of unpublished lectures entitled Society as a Game and the Function of Government, that RAWLS probably delivered in 1951, in which he laid out his social and political vision for the first time. Now, these are important for a variety of reasons, but I'm going to focus on two. So first, here RAWLS presented an extremely minimalist and surprisingly limited account of the state. And second, here he uses for the very first time the idea of a property-owning democracy. Society, RAWLS wrote, was not like an organism or a mechanism. Society was like a game. It was a game conducted according to agreed-upon rules that allowed players to have reasonable expectations and make reasonable decisions. In the analogy of games with social institutions, RAWLS found the, quote, most important proposition of social philosophy, that it is not necessary to have central direction to achieve a rational social order, end quote. Now, here was an old vision of commercial society, characterized by virtues of fellowship and sympathy, where interpersonal relations are shaped by the bottom up, by rules and conventions, not by a strong sovereign authority. Indeed, in 1959, RAWLS could still write that, quote, the conception of justice I set out is perhaps closer to Hume's view than any other. Yet RAWLS here also found a way of thinking that was particular to a novel strand of mid-century liberal thought in which game analogies flourished. RAWLS later made a list of these uses: game theory, Wittgenstein, Karl Popper, Piaget, H.L.A. Hart, and Frank Knight. RAWLS later used the idea of a game in his account of justification, but in these early lectures, it was the analogy with society that preoccupied him. And the vision of the game he drew was not from game theory, but from Frank Knight's description of business as a competitive game, with the characteristic ingredients of luck, skill, and effort. RAWLS applied Knight's model of the good game to his vision of society. In a good game, players need to be able to win if they play by the rules. They must think they have control over their fate. A good game, I'm paraphrasing RAWLS here, was one that was worth playing. That meant success could not accumulate too much, these are quotes, and players had to have a roughly equal start. What was therefore needed, RAWLS continued, quote, is some kind of control over the game to redistribute some of the rewards of winning. But how much control? So this was a key question for RAWLS. What kind of institutional intervention was necessary to keep the game of society running smoothly? Now, RAWLS's answer at this stage, this is 1951, was not much. The function of government, he wrote, was to enforce a minimal set of rules to achieve broad conditions of social order that we could all agree were important. What did these include? RAWLS listed the rules of the road against theft, burglary, arson, murder, for contracts, public health and safety, rules against fraud, impure foods and drugs, and the rules for establishing money, weights and measures. Quote, we don't need agreement all down the line from theology to tastes in tea, end quote. And tastes in tea actually here replaced a prior striking example, the days of the week. So government was a regulatory authority, a system of rules designed to stabilize society. And RAWLS used various metaphors here. Government was like an umpire or an enforcer of traffic. It enforced common rules to stop people driving into each other, but it must never tell people where to go. To do so would be to tyrannize them, RAWLS insisted. People don't want to be told what to believe or value. They want to be able to drive in the direction they choose. So, what does RAWLS' use of these metaphors here tell us? So in a political landscape where many attacked planning but nonetheless accepted the need for substantial government intervention in the economy, these constraints that Rawls placed on the scope of legitimate state action, as well as the metaphors he deployed, I want to suggest put him in unexpected company with those who are critics of state intervention. The idea of limiting government to the control of traffic and the image of the highway was very common among early neo- and ordo-liberals. Walter Lippmann used it in 1937, Hayek and Lionel Robbins did too, alongside the metaphor of the game to differentiate the liberal from the planned state. Earlier, but famously, Herbert Hoover used the image of government as umpire. Now, Rawls's usage of such analogies tracked these as he envisaged a minimalist state. The state's role was not to intervene in associational life, he argued elsewhere, but to allow people to disassociate from them and to afford sanctuary. Political processes, he wrote, and I'm quoting, could not be relied upon to run the economy. Political change needed to be slow and rule-bound. Redistributive changes, and I'm quoting again, could be worked out within this general framework, but government ought not to be a purposeful factor in their occurrence. That said, the rules of government interference could change over time as beliefs changed. Rawls listed the aim of maximum rather than full employment as an example of a new sort of government action, and in this he closely reflected the Keynesian consensus and the language of the recent Maximum Employment Bill. All this, Rawls said, amounted not to a laissez-faire vision, but a prenez garde one. It was not possible to return to the laissez-faire ideals that a half-century of state-building and war had eclipsed. Yet the functions of government should still be constrained by the idea that we should take care. We should beware of centralized power, Rawls wrote, and watch out for those who might want to define our purposes, values, and ends, both in times of peace and emergency. Now, Rawls here is invoking a kind of anti-totalitarian slippery slope reasoning. The attempt to define the ends of citizens, he writes, may mean the use of assassins, informers, and gas chambers. But he was also invoking a wartime anti-totalitarianism in service of a peacetime anti-statism. It is often assumed that such skepticism about government was a natural response to the war. But recent historical work has suggested that the US government was more legitimate than ever immediately following the war. As such, this kind of wariness was not the standard response to war, but one common amongst a certain species of critic of planning. I want to suggest that Rawls's early vision of society as a game should therefore be read as an amalgamation of various strains of mid-century state skepticism that at this moment prioritized this one. So what does this skepticism entail? First, a pluralism, constructed out of the communitarianism that Rawls put forward in his senior thesis. Like many post-war pluralists, the young Rawls was very taken with Tocqueville, both his idea of the New England townships as great schools of democracy, and how associations might play a role in restricting, quote, the gigantic engine of encroachment that was the welfare state. Without associations, the individual would, quote, be left helpless before the state and against other concentrations of power. The totalitarian state is the state of the unassociated man. Second, this skepticism also issued in a series of demands characteristic of post-war minimalist liberalism. Government had to allow consumer sovereignty, the entrepreneurial control of resources, a constitutional bill of rights, and equality of opportunity. The young Rawls conceded that the state would have to intervene sometimes in order to halt the build-up of economic and political power, to stop the game stalling. The challenge was how to sustain non-interference and meanwhile to ensure the stability of the game over time, to balance freedom and order. Now, in discussing this, Rawls introduced the idea that his prenez garde state should aim at a particular settlement, a property-owning democracy. So I'm going to now read quite a long quotation where this comes for the first time. Government should follow a program designed both to protect the necessary rewards of playing, as well as to guarantee, if not an equal start, for this is impossible, at least that sort of situation in which most persons we want to play will think that they have an equal enough start to keep the game moving. More definitely, this means assuring a fairly wide distribution of property. We want a property-owning democracy where everybody has a stake. But on the other hand, we must allow numerous and substantial rewards above the average to draw forth the efforts of the players. This obviously is difficult to do. It requires the most difficult sort of balancing. And it requires a constant policing, not only in the shape of enforcing those rules of the game which specify the game, but in the shape of keeping things even, end quote. So this is the puzzle that came to preoccupy Rawls, how to achieve a, quote, wide distribution of resources and power and prevent the concentration of resources and power while still rewarding success so as not to stall the game. Okay, so what's at stake here? Let me draw out a couple of points. So first, as is well known, Rawls never completely gives up on the idea of society as a game. As he came to build his account of the basic structure in the 1950s, he had this in mind, including the implicit wariness of the state. The idea of the basic structure had its proximate origins in Rawls's adaptation of the Wittgensteinian notion of practices, which he set out early in his practice conception of rules, but the practice with its constitutive rules came to take the place of the game. Now, from a certain point of view, these metaphors are all ways of underplaying or not thinking about the state. It is often said by both critics outside and within the Rawlsian tradition that Rawlsianism in some sense lacks a robust concept of the state. And I want to suggest this is not a coincidence. There is a historical reason for this. The aversion to conceptualizing the state has its roots in a liberal wariness of the administrative and war-making state at mid-century. Like many post-war liberal political scientists, Rawls did not conceive of the state either as an active interventionist agent of planning or a corporate person, or for that matter, a quasi-autonomous arena of struggle. Instead, Rawls experimented with accounts of society that were prominent at mid-century, that indicated a self-regulating capacity but limited the need for political intervention, ideas of equilibrium, systems, and so on. Eventually, he bundled the state in with the social institutions of civil society within the idea of the basic structure. And the basic structure was where Rawls arrived after his search for a set of concepts that could both abstract from post-war social and political realities and capture the potential for a better society that Rawls thought those realities contained. Now, the basic structure concept did capture certain dimensions of the post-war American state very nicely. It's functioning, for instance, across public and private lines. But this capacious concept also meant that many institutional and agential dimensions of the state were attenuated in Rawls's vision, as a number of recent critiques have suggested. Now, Rawls spent far more time exploring the juridical and legislative institutions than the executive or bureaucratic ones he wanted to constrain. This focus has been reflected in liberal egalitarianism and the project of modern political philosophy more broadly, particularly in the US, where, unlike its German and British counterparts, state theory has not been central. Of course, the scope of the basic structure has been much challenged, often from below, from the perspective of expanding it to include gender injustice and the family, ethos, associations, work, so on. But the basic structure has not much been reconceptualized or revised from above. To extend the game metaphor, the focus has often been on the starting places of players in the game, on who counts as a player, how to distribute rewards of success, rather than on who manages, controls, and coaches the teams. Now, this has recently started to change with a new wave of philosophical debate on bureaucracy, administration, welfare delivery, privatization, that taken together, I think, looks set to bring the state back in. What I am suggesting is that the relative absence of the state in liberal egalitarianism can in part be explained by the fact that Rawls set out to formulate his conception of state and society at a moment when he was very wary of the former's encroachment on the latter. So that's the first point I want to make about what these early essays about society and government can tell us about Rawls and the project of modern political philosophy. Now, the second point is that we should understand Rawls's prenez garde minimalist state as intertwined with his vision of property-owning democracy. The fact that Rawls first formulated this idea in 1951 is important in itself as a redating of the history of the idea of property-owning democracy. The later source Rawls cited, with the typical generosity that has often misled his readers, was the economist James Mead. But his account of property-owning democracy would not be published for over a decade, so Rawls does not get this idea from Mead, as has become conventional wisdom. Now, Rawls did not use the idea as a term of art yet in 1951, and he provided no source. If it had a specific provenance, I think it was likely drawn from his readings of Tocqueville and Jefferson, whom Rawls characterized in the same year as denouncing concentrations of property and advocating its wide distribution. But while the provenance may not be clear, I think that the political stakes of defending property-owning democracy at this precise moment are. Rawls's preference in these years was for a politics of property over one of income and pay disputes. What mattered to the young Rawls was less active redistribution by a planning state and more the dispersal of power away from centres towards peripheries. Now, this vision is in some ways familiar to us from Rawls's later work, though of course he departs in a great many ways from this early sketch. What I want to stress is that the political meaning of these ideas have also changed significantly since Rawls formulated them in the shadow of the New Deal and war. Rawls's idea of a property-owning democracy would later be mediated through his engagement with the revisionist wing of the British Labour Party, which he encountered following his time at Oxford in 1952-3, including the works of Mead. In the 1980s, there was a resurgence of interest in property-owning democracy in British debates about the future of the Labour Party, again, where it reappeared as an alternative to both the planning state and market socialism, in defences of social democracy against old Labour socialism. And it's in reading these debates that Rawls seems to have radicalised his initial presentation of property-owning democracy and accentuated its departure from welfare state capitalism, as becomes clear in published later works. Now today, in another twist, the idea of property-owning democracy is more popular with the leftist leadership of the British Labour Party, a leadership that is commonly seen as retreating to the old Labour of the 1970s, but whose ideas we might more profitably understand as a kind of domestication of old Labour via Rawlsian ideas of pre-distribution. So, what does all this tell us? Well, it certainly tells us something about the changing fate of liberalism beyond political philosophy. Since the 1950s, the centre of liberalism has moved to the right, towards the market, away from the state. A regime type that was motivated by a scepticism of state action, a scepticism that was an outlier at the turn of the 1950s, now reappears in proposals on a radical left that troubles many liberals. But to return to where I began this talk, I mentioned in my opening remarks that I think we underestimate the political distance between Rawls and ourselves. And what I mean by this is that it is striking that his ideas still provide so much of our conceptual architecture, given that the material, political, and ideological changes between the mid-century world created by depression and war and our own have been so vast in so many different ways. To say precisely how the circumstances of the post-war differ from our own is not, of course, the primary task of political philosophers or political theorists, or for that matter, historians of political thought. But as we take stock of Rawls's legacy and assess the future of his ideas, such considerations should, I think, have a place. A number of different interpretations might flow from this brief story I've told here. Perhaps it speaks to the tenacity and desirability of the idea of property-owning democracy. After all, the changing political valences and fortunes of an idea need not detract from its ethical worth. Or perhaps the origins of Rawlsian property-owning democracy in a defence of a minimalist government and a critique of the planning state should either call into question or confirm its attractiveness, depending on your commitments. Or perhaps this all speaks to the peculiar adaptability of Rawlsian ideas. Now, I do not want here to make a case for either of those positions, but I do want to suggest that the historicising move of paying attention to the changing meanings of concepts that otherwise appear stable can help us think about what political work philosophical ideas can do, and to reopen the question of the politics of political philosophy. Rawls himself knew well that his philosophical ideas could do different political work at different moments. What I have tried to show in this talk is that he was also very deliberate about what concepts he used to capture the changing political and social circumstances of post-war American society. That was visible both in his experimentation with ideas of games, practices, the basic structure, and so on, and in his sense of the impossibility of returning to laissez-faire. Now, it is a separate question, I'm going to set it aside, whether RAWLS'S experiments were successful at doing so in their own time. What I want to suggest is that taking stock of RAWLS'S legacy must involve also asking whether they still apply in ours. What would it mean for us to try to capture conceptually our changing circumstances in the way that RAWLS attempted to? Do we need to experiment in the ways that he did? Looking to the future of the project of modern political philosophy requires a reckoning with these kinds of questions, to ask whether our political questions are the same as RAWLS'S, and if not, or even if so, how his concepts might need to be changed to capture our predicament. Those questions are an important part of the broader effort to delineate what is living and what is dead in RAWLS'S philosophical liberalism. In order to do that properly, we also need some idea of the circumstances of its birth, why it has survived so long, and what the conditions of that survival have been. It is often said that these kinds of questions are outside the purview of philosophers, but I don't think it's clear that RAWLS agreed. Indeed, such an intellectual division of labour is in many respects part of the story of the reception of RAWLS and the transformation of political philosophy in his shadow. For many years, political philosophy has tended to build from RAWLS'S theory. Perhaps, looking forward amid the current crisis, we might be better off if we followed the young RAWLS'S spirit in this regard and built our own theories instead, as he did, from the ground up. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the organizers and to my fellow panelists. I guess I'm going last on this panel, but I really want to begin at the very beginning. So in that sense, we've gone in reverse order. What the word Christian means is indefinite. To some, it signifies a religion. To others, it implies a moral standard or code. And to certain of us, it suggests a pattern for social revolution. That's a quotation from John Rawls in spring of 1942, his junior year at Princeton. To certain of us, it suggests a pattern for social revolution. One of the delights of intellectual history is that sometimes the hunt for context becomes actual text. So this summer I was reading around in Princeton undergraduate publications just to get a sense of what was being said, and I stumbled upon a serious 10-page article by the young John Rawls entitled Christianity and the Modern World. I believe it's actually the earliest piece of argumentative writing we have from Rawls, written 7 months before he completed his senior thesis on Christian ethics, which has now been posthumously published and so widely read. Unlike that thesis, I don't think anyone besides me knows about this essay on Christianity and the modern world. So I thought I would use this august occasion to introduce it to you all. My hope is to tell you a little bit about its arguments, then say a few things about how it's important from a contextual perspective in terms of what it tells us about the water that the young Rawls was swimming in. But then, as a nod to the direction this conference is traveling, I do want to talk a little bit about what the early arguments of this essay might suggest to us about Rawls's moral and political theory, and to end on a note about how we might think about secularization in that regard. John Rawls was raised Episcopalian, but only became really religious as a junior in college. We don't know exactly what happened, but he had a conversion to serious Christianity that fall and began to consider the ordained ministry. Even a secular Rawlsian philosopher might regard this as providential, because that December 1941, Rawls belatedly switched his major from art and architecture to philosophy, the Princeton department in which he could best explore theology. The timing of this decision underscores how much the drama in Rawls's mind and soul was, at that moment, eclipsing even world affairs for him. He started the paperwork to switch his major a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. While literally all of his classmates were filling out the paperwork to accelerate their course of study so they could go join the war, Rawls is executing a major switch that's actually going to make it harder for him to graduate because he needs to catch up in philosophy coursework. He takes 3 philosophy classes that spring, including one intensely focused on theodicy, and his only other class is marine and air navigation, which he promptly fails due to absences. This is really not a person focused on defending Western civilization by going to war, even though we know he's going to end up in the Pacific Theater. This is a person focused on saving the soul of Western civilization. RAWLS'S wartime article, Christianity in the Modern World, is a striking call to stem the tide of secularization and make society truly Christian. It represents the very first time that the young RAWLS would call for a spirit of moral reform that begins with oneself and eventually leads to the reform of social institutions. The piece also shows RAWLS explicitly adopting the French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain's position on how God's grace transforms and perfects the spiritual freedom inherent in human nature. Maritain was lecturing at Princeton in the spring of 1941 and 1942, and RAWLS framed his article almost entirely in terms borrowed from Maritain's 1938 book, True Humanism. RAWLS'S basic aim was to diagnose whether Western civilization could fairly describe itself as Christian any longer. His verdict was that it could not, and then to call for it to return to faith before it became fully pagan. RAWLS had borrowed the term pagan for describing modern post-Christian society from Maritain. To RAWLS, it meant either accepting a deterministic view of a fully mechanized world, or else, more seductively, placing a mistaken egotistical faith in the human capacity to triumph in all things. RAWLS and Maritain traced both of these errors back to theological mistakes, the determinism of Calvinistic theology on one side, and the Pelagianism of the religion of reason on the other. At a minimum, RAWLS commented, if one endorsed this latter untrammeled faith in humanity, quote, the idea of grace as a factor in human life is allowed to float out the window upon reason and a rational optimism, which regards the world as essentially reasonable in all its processes. After tracing its origin through Locke and Leibniz and eventually into 19th century utilitarianism, RAWLS identified such an optimistic view in America with John Dewey, whose views represented, quote, the present-day faith in democracy and in man's ability to work out his own problems. But on the darker side, RAWLS thought this was problematic, but then he sort of really landed on the darker side, such an attitude of human pride could quickly lead to identifying moral value with, quote, strength and power. This approach, which the young RAWLS identified philosophically with Nietzsche, might seem humanistic in its glorification of human self-sufficiency, but in fact represented the annihilation of humanism by denying all obligations to humble love and service. This idea was borrowed straight from Maritain, who had written in True Humanism that by pushing God aside in order to make human freedom seem greater, humanity was eschewing grace and thereby actually destroying true freedom, which comes from God. We may say, he wrote, that the radical fault of anthropocentric humanism has been its anthropocentric quality, not its humanism. In other words, Christian personalists like Maritain and now young RAWLS insisted that the precious humanness of human beings was not eclipsed by the divine, but rather only revealed in right relationship to God. As RAWLS wrote in his essay, quote, when Nietzsche thought he was negating Christianity, he did not realize that he was negating that whole humanistic stream that made him possible. He stands at the end of Pelagian heresy. He is the final annihilation of grace. RAWLS really didn't like Nietzsche. That's consistent from very early on. On the other hand, an overemphasis on grace, to the exclusion of all human agency in the divine drama, the theological mistake of which RAWLS accused Luther and Calvin, would mean that, quote, the central notion of grace with freedom is lost, and with it the essence of Christianity. Determinism, whether materialist or theological, quote, completely destroys the moral life, for without freedom there can be no responsibility, and without responsibility, the intrinsic worth of doing good is lost. RAWLS, like the Episcopalian philosophy professors who influenced him most directly in those years, George Thomas and Theodore Green, was deeply committed to establishing a liberal theological position that accommodated both divine grace and human freedom. Human nature, for Green and Thomas, was not irredeemably fallen. Human beings, although they needed God's grace, could take redeemed free action in this world. On this they differed with neo-Orthodox theologians, whom they vigorously debated in person and in print in the theological discussion group. RAWLS took their side of the debate. As RAWLS summed up his personalist creed, the central idea of the Christian religion and the one that underlies all its beliefs is, it seems to me, the mystery of the togetherness between nature and grace. It is this conception which underlies the Christian conception of God as a person. Further, the Christian notion of the efficacy of moral effort comes from the idea of acting with God together, because the very phrase implies that nature can act positively after the reception of grace, that nature is not a slave. But note also that this togetherness also means that man must not consider himself able to live alone. Such a union implies always two factors, the nature, and the grace. The intrinsic value of individuals also is derived from this fundamental conception, for it recognizes that each man, regardless of wealth and intelligence, possesses value by virtue of his ability to enter into the relation of union between nature and grace. This text is Rawls's very earliest attempt to balance at the subtle position he would occupy throughout his philosophical life, granting deep value to the activity of human beings as expressions of human freedom and personality, while also refusing to measure value by the yardstick of success in such activities, all of which had to be regarded as a gift. Maritain offered Rawls in 1942 the best vocabulary he had yet found for describing the apparent paradox that he wished to ardently affirm, quote, the mystery of nature and grace and the mystery of grace and freedom, whereby, to quote Maritain, grace perfects nature and does not destroy it. Maritain offered Rawls a long theological tradition to claim for this personalist view. Here's a direct quote that Rawls borrowed from Maritain in the essay, insisting that this balance between grace and freedom was Christian, Catholic, and Orthodox. Maritain, like Thomas and Green, knew that the neo-Orthodox theologian Karl Barth would object that this species of personalist liberal theology was sowing the seeds of inevitable secularization through its own anthropocentric mistake, that of thinking that human beings could have agency in divine purposes that only and entirely God could accomplish. So in true humanism, Maritain took care to address the Barthian position directly, calling it archaic and anti-humanist, and writing that, quote, finally, Barth's error is that of Luther and of Calvin, is to think that grace does not vivify. On the other side of God's grace, Maritain insisted, stood human beings whose redemption gave them true freedom to act as children of God. Their nature was salvageable. The young Rawls had not read Barth, little of whose work had yet been translated into English, but he followed Maritain's critique of Reformation theology. As he wrote in Christianity and the Modern World, Luther realized, along with the great thinkers before him, that man alone cannot bridge the gap between himself and God, and that man, if unaided, inevitably falls into sin. But what Luther did not realize fully is the other side of the apparent paradox, man's freedom, which belongs to the essence of his nature and which is not taken from him, even though grace is necessary to keep him from error. By underestimating the degree of man's freedom, Luther is led to accept a deterministic theory of salvation, in which grace performs all acts to the exclusion of freedom. Here lies Luther's error, one which becomes even more exaggerated and perverted in Calvin. It's extremely important. Well, one thing is it's really important to understand that in being an Episcopalian, Rawls does not identify with the Reformed Protestant tradition. We often talk about Protestant theology and Catholic theology. It's quite important here that he's been raised in an Episcopal tradition that's sort of sitting in between. It's also just extremely important to understand that young Rawls's theology is, like Thomas's and Green's and Maritain's, liberal in the old-fashioned sense of meaning concerned with freedom, even as it is also liberal in the sense of being generously and inclusively framed. Before turning to the bearing of Rawls's arguments in this earliest essay on his later thinking, however, I'd like to say a few words about how this new article of Rawls's helps to fill in the contextual picture. So first of all, it gives us a direct link between Rawls and Maritain. Previously, we had known that they were on campus at the same time, but Maritain didn't teach Rawls, and Rawls doesn't reference Maritain in the senior thesis, so there was no basis for suggesting a direct influence. It was already clear that Rawls's personalist theology was informed by his liberal Episcopalian professors like Thomas and Green, and by his reading of the Swiss theologian Emil Brunner. Brunner, despite being closely connected to Karl Barth and the milieu of Reformed continental neo-Orthodox theology, actually disagreed with Barth on precisely the point of how grace interacts with human nature. Brunner's theory of the point of contact between God and human beings put him in the same camp on this issue as Thomas and Green and Maritain and Rawls. So the way that the young Rawls made use of Brunner's thought underscores that his theological outlook was liberal, not neo-Orthodox. I've made this point elsewhere, but up until now we had to treat Maritain's arguments as a parallel Catholic personalist discourse to this Protestant one. And the discovery of Rawls's deep engagement with Maritain provides an opportunity to retell the story of the wartime development of Christian personalism as having Catholic and Protestant threads that are much more robustly intertwined than previously acknowledged. It's also important, I'd say, for us to learn how to distinguish between neo-Orthodox rhetoric and neo-Orthodox theology. Rawls's essay on Christianity in the modern world is deeply influenced by the neo-Orthodox rhetoric of crisis and decision. To quote him, the Nazis, the fascists, and the communists have made the choice. They are no longer neutral but pagan, nor can we escape the decision. There are but two alternatives. Either we become Christian or we become pagans. We cannot paddle in both streams. This sounds very strongly like Reinhold Niebuhr, who he's reading and who shows up on campus while he's writing his thesis, including in its style of portentous almost embrace of the judgment of the world. If the culture failed to reconvert to serious Christianity and instead succumbed to paganism, Rawls concluded his essay by saying that things would be hard, but, quote, our religion has lived through one dark ages. There is no reason why it cannot live through another. Again, this rhetoric is neo-Orthodox in tone and in the dark collective directions it believes human sin can lead. But when one scratches the surface of the young Rawls's theology, one finds him deeply optimistic in his hope for the world and relentlessly insistent on the possibilities open for human agential freedom on the other side of grace. Rawls believed in a real alternative to the fallen paganism of the 1940s world, an alternative in which a collective decision to recommit and adhere to real Christian values would provide the, quote, pattern for social revolution. Rawls and his mentors all thought it made sense to be optimistic about human life together, so long as grace was allowed to operate. Like Maritain, Rawls insisted that human beings were sacred because they are, quote, ordered to things that are superior to time. But he thought that human beings began their eternal work within time. So Rawls endorsed the idea that after reconversion, then the next step would be reorientation in regard to social life. Quote, we must rehabilitate our new knowledge and our new modes of living to the Christian faith. In Maritain's words, quote, this transfiguration should extend really, and not only figuratively, to the social structures of humanity, and so bring about, in the degree to which that is possible here on earth and in given historical circumstances, a veritable socio-temporal realization of the Gospels. This was exactly the course that Rawls was trying to take in Christianity in the modern world. Becoming aware of one's Christian responsibilities was a path towards a far better form of community life. We notice, of course, the lack of space in his rhetoric for other faiths, but that is because his eyes are fixed on, at this moment, on saving the world from self-annihilating secularism, not on working out the mechanics of the religiously plural state. Rawls's rhetoric will strike us as foreign, so it's contextually important here not to get distracted into thinking that the devout young Rawls was a theological conservative. His theology was always liberal, in the sense of generous, hopeful, social reformist, and, again, as I've discussed elsewhere, universalist. But I'd like to turn back to that other sense in which Rawls's youthful theology was liberal, in other words, concerned with freedom, because I think this earliest essay of his can tell us something about the structure of Rawls's thought, specifically in relation to free will, that would prove enduring. One of the things Rawls is most famous for is his deflationary account of merit or desert. We've heard about it a bit on this panel. His skepticism about how much credit you can claim for your talents, and therefore how much of life is governed by our shared institutions, should be determined by circumstances that are arbitrary from a moral point of view. In their introduction to Rawls's senior thesis, Josh Cohen and Thomas Nagel immediately noted that Rawls was making a version of that argument even in 1942. As Rawls said in his thesis, the human person sees that he possesses nothing that he's not been given. Never again can he hope to boast of his good deeds, of his skill, of his prowess, for he knows that these are gifts. In his book manuscript, Liberalism and Theodicy, where's Eric, which many in this room had the pleasure of reading and discussing last month, our panel chair, Eric Nelson, has recently argued that the early appearance of this rejection of merit shows that the young Rawls formed this attitude in the context of a deeply anti-Pelagian theology, one which was essentially determinist in its rejection of all but an utterly negligible degree of human agency and therefore merit. Nelson's view is that even as Rawls abandoned theology, his, quote, essential anti-Pelagianism remained intact as a habit of mind. This story about an intellectual hangover, as it were, is meant to trouble Rawlsians with the question of whether the mature Rawls's rejection of merit is really coherent or appealing. Now, I'd say that the language I've introduced from Rawls's essay on Christianity and the modern world should complicate Nelson's account. Rawls's rejection of determinism there is just as full-throated as his rejection of Pelagianism. These are some of the examples I quoted earlier. In fact, Rawls insists the possibility of, quote, free, spontaneous acts by humans, quote, lies at the heart of Christianity. But here's a puzzle. Rawls is relentlessly emphasizing human freedom, yet he still has this position against merit. If we take him at his word that he's as anti-determinist as he is anti-Pelagian, how do we square that circle? Let's return to another quotation from Rawls in Christianity and the Modern World. I think the answer that Rawls is giving us here is something we might call freedom after grace. Quote, nature can act positively after the reception of grace. Nature is not a slave. This is consistent with Maritain statement that grace perfects nature and does not destroy it. To Rawls, human freedom is an essential part of human nature, and what God's grace does is restore or unlock that freedom, not obliterate nor render it irrelevant. For Rawls, however, there are things that freedom after grace simply doesn't do, and one is to obsess about merit. Doing so is a sign of spiritual pride, and after one has felt the great thankfulness that comes from recognizing and receiving God's graciousness, Rawls just thinks the vanity of claiming credit for uprightness and accomplishments melts away. But this is not the same as doubting the possibility of good acts accomplished through human agency. It's just that we cease to think of the point of a good act as being rewarded for it. As Rawls writes in Christianity and the Modern World, quote, a good act is, among other things, one which seeks no gain as its ultimate end. He thinks that humans freely act after grace, and that we can do so in ways that are good, but there is no thought of winning a garland. After grace, we see the world differently. To illustrate the point, let's turn to the classic metaphor of a race. Let's have it be a swim race instead of a foot race. A version of the typical merit debate might be you're lining up in a lake for a swim race. Then you realize that some of the people have stones tied to their feet. Everyone agrees that's not fair, we should get those untied, but then we get into a philosophical dispute about where to make the distinction. What in our life together has the nature of a stone tied to someone's foot, an illegitimate disadvantage, and what has the nature of a legitimate advantage, such as a more powerful backstroke? The libertarians object that they take Rawls to be saying that no advantages can legitimately belong to you, and so they argue that in banishing desert, Rawls also banishes human identity and agential freedom. But I'd say that Rawls's aim with his anti-desert rhetoric from the beginning is actually to shake people out of a merit fixation on his way to a more complete reorientation. Here's what freedom after grace is like for Rawls. You open your eyes after grace, and you find yourself in a lake, and you notice that a number of people around you are struggling to stay afloat because they have rocks tied to their feet. And so you leap into action and start swimming around and untying them. But you're not doing this because you think, only once I untie all these rocks can we have a fair race that I can then win. The race couldn't be further from your mind. You're untying the rocks because you love the people in the lake and want them to flourish there alongside you. And it seems obvious that you wouldn't dream of swimming laps until the conditions for that were accomplished. This is a story in which there is plenty of agential freedom. Rawls just doesn't think we should conceive of the use of our freedom as competition, our relationships to others as competitors, and the scenario of our lives as a race before some objective judge. He thinks that's a mental and spiritual trap, and he's trying to break us out of it. I actually have a whole theory of the therapeutic Rawls and what he's trying to do for his reader, but that's a topic for another day. In Rawls's view, God had the option to judge us in that merit-based way, and yet did not. That's what we know and feel so keenly after grace. And so God is trying to point us away from merit towards a different orientation. As he wrote in his thesis, God gave when we were undeserving. God then does not want merit that he can reward. He does not want us to enter into a contest or amassing good works as a bargain for future blessings. He wants to establish a community which will last through all ages, a community not torn apart by those boasting of their good deeds. Again, this gets back to the question of resentment. True community does not count the merit of its members. So instead of merit, redeemed people become concerned with community. To quote Rawls again, the givenness of God's love judges, redeems, and binds together. But the point of emphasizing that givenness is not that God's agency is vast and human agency is thus piddling in comparison. The point is that God's gracious action aims to teach us that human value qua humanity is vast, while human value qua accomplishment is piddling. If we go back again to this sort of keystone quote, I've highlighted a part at the end, each man, regardless of wealth and intelligence, possesses value by virtue of his ability to enter into the relation of union between nature and grace. Rawls writes, he's identifying value with the human capacity to live freely after receiving grace, betokened by one's participation in relational community with God and other people. And I suggest this is similar to the way he talks of the threshold condition about moral personality in Theory of Justice. The core takeaway here about RAWLS'S theological account is that there is nothing unfree or non-agential about reorienting oneself away from individualism and towards community. In Freedom After Grace, the two meanings of liberal, concerning freedom and concerning an attitude of generosity, meet. By grace, a person is freed from selfishness, fear, and obsession with merit to act freely in good and generous ways. Now, to end, I hope that this discussion has established at least one line of connection between RAWLS'S early theology and his mature thought. I'd like to conclude with a comment about what this case might suggest to us about how we should think about secularization in the history of ideas. As we attend to what past thinkers carried from religious thought into their moral and political theories that are framed more secularly, and how much sense such transformations make, I'd suggest that the concepts that are most difficult to secularize in an intellectually coherent way are those that concern ideas like grace or the Holy Spirit. There are many mechanical theological theories of, for example, atonement, sovereignty, etc., which are easy to secularize for the simple reason that they were actually already based on this worldly analogies. But when a pivotal role in a theory is played by an unmoved mover, by something spontaneous or gratuitous, i.e. by something that would have been described in theological terms as a mystery, then secularization becomes sticky, because there is no real way to bring such a spirit to earth without killing it. As I've written elsewhere, I think RAWLS'S pursues one of the only plausible paths to the naturalization of such a religious worldview over the 1950s and 1960s by working out a Wittgensteinian theory of human nature in which he embeds a mysterious capacity for other-directed love that could spark the recipient, usually a child, into responding with similar love and thus entering the moral universe. Spiritualization of human nature is perhaps the only real way to take God out of such an equation. But that story still leaves RAWLS'S, in the end, with love as the unmoved mover in his theory. And since he comes from a tradition that claims God is love, there's a real question about how far he's actually traveled in that case. Let me end on a final quotation from the young RAWLS'S in the spring 1942 article that I introduced today. The fact is that our culture grew up within the Christian tradition and has even in its most radical manifestations borrowed heavily from it. These philosophies ultimately have their source on a Christian ground. You'll see he goes on to call philosophy a perversion of that tradition in this quotation. A more gentle word might be outgrowth. But it seems to me that the project of modern political philosophy, as influenced by RAWLS'S, owes a great deal, whether it knows it or not, to a vision of freedom after grace, of true human freedom and generosity towards others, becoming inextricably intertwined in our mature conception of what it means to live well in the world. And if the seeds of that capacity in human nature are not to be coaxed out of the ground by the sunlight of God's grace and love, as they were in RAWLS'S original story, then it is a real and important question for RAWLSians as to what other mechanisms may be hoped for to serve that purpose. Thank you.
Well, these were three extraordinary papers, and I know there will be many, many questions. I'll just get the ball rolling with a thought that struck me as actually appearing in slightly different guise, but in each of the papers, and that is this very distinctive kind of Rawlsian, well, let's say an ambiguity sometimes, at the very least, but certainly a double interest. On the one hand, in what is actually the case about something like human nature? That is it in fact true? How free are we in fact? How responsible can we be said to be for our actions, as opposed to how we think of ourselves, right? So the difference between, let's say, the metaphysical and something like the social psychological. And right from the beginning, Leif was asking us to think about the social psychological. I mean, and RAWLS'S on social psychology, that is, how thinking of yourself in a particular way namely the way that meritocrats think of themselves, or the way that meritocrats inculcate a particular way of thinking about responsibility and merit, causes alienation, resentment, and a sense of impasse, powerlessness, and so on. Right the way through to Katrina's fascinating discussion about games and RAWLS'S claim that the important thing in the game is that everyone thinks they're starting from the same position. Just sort of a fascinating choice of words. Again, not that they're actually starting from the same position, but that they think they are, moving all the way then to Kenzie's fascinating reconstruction of this very early RAWLS'ian idea about what is the salutary way to think about your own agency, right? That is the difference between the debate about whether we can actually be said to be meritorious, deserving, or earning, right? And a different but sometimes intertwined and confused debate about what it's good for us to think about our own agency, right? For other reasons, let's say reasons of community. So maybe I would just get the ball rolling by asking each of you, if you'd like, to say something about how you see the continuity in that sort of doubled line of thought from the early to the later rules.
Oh, okay, sure. I'll go first. Yeah, so I think a couple of things that are interesting on that. I would push back on, well, I do think that RAWLS'S is working on how we're going to think about ourselves in this world after grace. I don't think he would agree that it's a situation in which we're thinking one way and then there's a reality. Like there's a reality where actually we're building up merit points, but we just it's not good for us to think that way. It's like he really actually thinks that whole framework resolves. Like the race is canceled, right? And I think that's important. And I think it's particularly important because actually I would say that RAWLS'S pretty consistently throughout his thought, he's very strong on the idea that we should have a theory of morals that is both intellectually coherent and allows you, the person who understands it, to sincerely have morals. Like he thinks there's a lot of theories of morality that are in the space around him that are really theories of social control, or like why it would be good if people would act this way, and that they create a distance between their explanations of morality that create a distance between the person who understands what's really going on and the moral agent. And maybe we could describe, this is a great community where we would sort of socialize, we'd have certain techniques and socialize certain things because that way people would be nice to each other. But RAWLS says, no, for this to be real morality, you have to be able to stand as the moralist who understands that inside of it, and also in totally good faith, believe it yourself. There can't be this distance. So in that sense, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think actually one of the striking things about RAWLS'S thought that continues is that he is a moral realist or I've said in other places, a moral naturalist in a way that is not what people think you mean when you say that, which is that he thinks moral persons are real, and he thinks that the moral claims that we make on each other are real, and in that sense, it's sort of, you can sort of say inside a frame, but only to the extent that you're saying in a Wittgensteinian way. There's nothing outside the frame, you're always, but he really does, I think, believe that the way he's trying to teach us to think about ourselves and our moral agency and our free will is also a reflection of how it really is.
So that passage that I read out,
I wonder if you could perhaps get closer to the microphone.
like that.
They are there.
Thank you. So I think that passage I read out, so it's RAWLS'S underlining, not mine, where he says we'll think that they have an equal enough start to keep the game moving. And nowhere in those two essays does the second face come through. So so I don't want to say that he's saying false beliefs are okay, but there's nowhere in the essay that he says that that's not the case. And actually, I don't think there's anywhere right in this moment in these political writings that he says that's not the case. So
and going forward, you might say all the way to the later essays, right? What's important is that we think of ourselves as responsible for our ends, that we think of ourselves, that locution stays with him. Yeah.
And so I think that there is that doubling of the interpersonal, and then the kind of from the moral point of view, that not being sufficient gets more pronounced as you go along. But I think in the earlier, the ambiguity is even clearer and more striking. Now, I don't know what necessarily to make of that. I do think that there are places in the early 50s and in the later 50s in certain essays where he is talking about more explicitly political questions that become more recognizable in theory of justice, so questions of what kind of social minimum we should have and so on, where he does seem to think that after a certain point, it's not possible to make people as equal as we might like, and therefore it is important that they think they are more equal than they are. Now, and I don't think that necessarily plays out in theory of justice, but I think that in the 50s, it's not clear that, I don't think he's clear which way he's going yet on that question. So.
Terrific, thank you. So famously, Theory of Justice is a book that says how people are, and Political Liberalism is a book about how citizens see themselves. The transition is around the Dewey lecture, and when I was reading out some of the psychological stuff from Theory of Justice, I found that these strong claims in theory about how people are at first felt like they were conflicting with the goals of political liberalism, not to rely on comprehensive doctrines and so on. So, remember the passages about money being a temptation to indulgence and emptiness, or what men want is meaningful work and free association with others. Can those kinds of psychological claims survive the transition to political liberalism? And at first I was worried about that, but I think actually it might be possible to defend those kinds of strong psychological claims, even in a political liberal frame. First of all, I do think that some of the claims RAWLS was making are part of the public culture in American society. American society has always very much valued hard work, so when RAWLS says what men want is meaningful work, I think that's something you can draw out of our tradition. But then also, when it comes to de-emphasizing a positional desire for riches, I think that can be defended on political grounds. Remember, in the 80s, there were all these debates about whether RAWLS was neutral or not. And people like Steve Macedo came out with these books saying, actually, it doesn't have to be neutral. You can defend a robust series of virtues on the basis of political values. I think you could also defend a discouragement of desires for positional goods like money and political power, simply on the political basis that those kinds of desires are ultimately counterproductive to justice and potentially destabilizing in a democratic society.
Great. Well, the floor is open. Johan?
Okay, this is
Maybe just introduce yourself very briefly, give your name and...
This is a question for Katrina Forrester about the Society as a Game lecture. So perhaps the most striking analogy that RAWLS draws between society and games in his mature philosophy is his claim that in both domains the appropriate conception of justice is a conception of justice as pure procedural justice, right? So what outcomes result within a game set up with fair rules, conducted under fair conditions, whatever outcomes result are fair just for that reason. As Rawls puts it, there's no independent criterion for right result. Likewise, the distributive shares that citizens receive within a just basic structure are just for having been produced in that way. Again, there's no independent criterion of the right outcome. Question, is this analogy between games and society already present in the 1951 lecture, or does that come later?
Comes later.
Michael Rosen.
Fascinating, three fascinating talks, and Kenzie, Michael Rosen, question, admiration for all three talks, but a question specifically to Kenzie, who's looked at something I've thought about for a long time, and I suppose that all of us have, from a very new angle. Am I being too, the first part of my question is, am I being too crude when you say that the way to understand rules is not as a skeptic about freedom, but a skeptic about merit?
I mean, obviously that has but yes, I would basically endorse that.
Okay,
yes.
so given that, though, I have a question about the way in which someone could consistently get rid of a theological conception of merit. Because one aspect of the Christian religion, well, not just the Christian religion, but particularly the Christian religion, is that it is looking forward to a time of judgment and a life afterwards. So, the debates about grace, about merit, have very much to do with the justification of salvation. Now, at one point you used the word universalist. I'm not sure whether you used the word universalist in the sense of a view in which there wasn't going to be a last judgment at all. But it seems to me that it's very hard to sustain a theology with a last judgment without some kind of conception of merit or the familiar and obviously for rules uncomfortable ideas of grace as something, as it were, itself unmerited, but which would have the most momentous consequences in relation to salvation. Did Rawls have thoughts about this, or do you have thoughts about Rawls's thoughts?
Yes, I do, and he did. So I wrote a piece in Modern Intellectual History that talks about this at greater length, but basically I would say Rawls is a universal salvationist for some of the reasons that you've just articulated. And I think, again, this is about the deep structure of his thought, he does not see a need for there to be a point at the end where some people win and some people lose. That's not, and in fact, he reacts extremely strongly against that. I would say, if we go into the realm of biography, that there's a significant piece of his reaction to that has to do with the fact that much as theological conceptions like that have always been troubled by children who die young, Rawls lost two brothers early, and the sense that whatever the world is, it's not a reward game, and it's not a game in which, and it just doesn't make any sense, right? If you've got people who disappear early in life, if you're gonna, and obviously lots of religions have come up with ways of solving that problem, and infant baptism is a key piece of that in the Christian tradition in the U.S. But Rawls has a pretty strong reaction against that, and I also think it's important to your point about how, the Christian idea is that there's salvation for some people or whomever at the end, at a sort of last judgment. Rawls, and he develops this in a more thorough way in the early 50s when he's reading a lot more theology, but he has more of what you might call what has been called a sort of realized eschatological view, which is one in which the kingdom of God is always there, and you can kind of live in it at any given moment, should you choose to do so. And actually, nothing separates this lecture hall now from this lecture hall in the kingdom of God, except for all of our wills. And so that there is no dimension of time that has to run through, right? So exactly, right. Right, and that's the thing is, and I should say, universal salvationism has been a long-running minority report in the Christian theological tradition. It literally goes back to Origen. And so Rawls is not a first in this. He's picking up, and he becomes increasingly aware. This is his instinct from very early, and then he becomes increasingly aware of ways in which to bolster it intellectually. But that's the way I would say in which it's consistent, is that he really doesn't think that there's a point at which, we need to settle scores. And he thinks that the grace of God is for a universal community project. And so what happens on the other side of grace with your freedom is you realize that you've been invited into bringing the whole of creation, like together into this community that is ultimately destined to be in.
So why isn't that a determinist account of salvation? In other words, you might say, well, universalism looks very liberal, everyone gets saved, but everyone being saved is as certain as some people being saved and some people being damned on other eschatologies. Why? I mean, if everyone is saved, then surely no one has a choice not to be saved.
Well, but except that the question is do you think that the relevant thing about your life, like we live our whole life, okay, let's say like I live my whole life in a family, right? We don't have the conception that at the end of the day we're going to sort who was really in this family and who was like excommunicated from it, right? So there's nothing determinist about the way in which my relationships and my life in that family fall out over the course of it. Like I'm still acting as a free agent and having those relationships. It's just there's no judgment sorting point that's put at the end of that. I guess what I'm saying again is that I don't think that to have freedom you need to have some kind of a sort at the end, and then the question is like I'm not free unless I could have acted in a way to lead me to either be damned or saved. Like that's just not a framework that one has to accept on like the meaning of free life in the world. You're giving me a skeptical look. So
No.
But,
A fascinated look.
but just that's just not.
David, yeah.
I also found all three really fascinating. My question is to try to draw a link. Thanks. Well, I want to put on the record, I enjoyed all three talks very much. My question is for Leif. I want to mainly just draw him out some more because it seems like there's a natural question at the end that you must have thought about. So you're thinking a lot about the connection between basically political philosophy and public life. But the organizing idea I think that's left at the end is, what about this idea of a public conception of justice? What would it take to have one? Could justice as fairness count as one? And what are the rules? What would count? And I guess a first step in what the answer would be we want to know what's the purpose that's needed for. So I want to draw you out on this. On the one hand, if it requires understanding the original position flowchart, I agree with you, it's hopeless. But if what's needed is a shared basis of justification, it doesn't feel like that probably would be necessary. At the other end, and maybe I'm misreading the Society of Self-Respect, it must be more than just having a few touchstones. As elegantly and eloquently as you laid out the touchstones of a Society of Self-Respect, very valuable. So far I'm not sure that's enough for a shared conception of justice, a public conception of justice. So anyway, I wonder what you think it would take to count, why we need one, and now what are the prospects for something like justice as fairness?
Great, thank you, Dave. And this is something that Dave and I have been talking about for some time. Well, think about it together. We start with this strong publicity requirement in RAWLS'S, the third level of the full publicity condition. It says that the public justification should be known by every citizen, or at least accessible to all citizens who take an interest in politics. And that is quite a robust demand on the theory, and it puts a lot of limits on what can be in the theory. And so as you see, I'm tempted to go for very simple, complex, compact starting points. And then we see how much we can push them out and still have something that's accessible to all citizens. Now, at a certain point, I think you will be willing to give up on the publicity requirement, and maybe I will too. But I think I'm willing to go with the publicity requirement quite some way for the sake of mutual justification with our fellow and equal citizens. So perhaps this is a challenge to all of us who are doing this kind of political philosophy. If at some point we think that we're leaving our fellow citizens behind, what's our justification for giving up a publicity requirements where we can look at our fellow citizens in the eye and say things like, in this country, everyone can have self-respect, and they'll understand that and accept it. And then we can start talking more about the institutional details.
Just a tiny follow-up, that's helpful. But one way to think about what might be needed for a public conception of justice, and maybe you don't disagree disagree with this is to maybe compare it to the way in which we might draw on the Constitution as a shared conception of justice.
Good.
And I accept publicity, but I don't think it has to be accessible to the public. All the fine doctrinal differences to figure out what the real theory of the Constitution is.
Yeah.
And if some theorist said we need that, I just don't see why we need that. And now justice as fairness, I don't know how you want to tell the story. Is the original position part of justice as fairness? Or is justice as fairness the conception of justice organized by the two principles that get selected by way of the original position? Anyway, if it's the latter, it looks like this is more tractable. They could understand how that theory of justice works.
Yeah. Well, as an exercise in Rawls scholarship, in preparation for this, I read through the books again, and I just kept coming across passages where Rawls says the original position is central to the justification of everything. And so when he starts talking about the publicity requirement, it has to go to the original position. And as you can see, I've become discouraged about the possible publicity of the original position. And so the talk is really looking for other bases in the work that could be more accessible. Now, I really do agree with you that at a certain point, when it comes to constitutional interpretation, institutional design, publicity may be attenuated. I was just talking to Professor Michelman and saying I went to his office hours 30 years ago and asked about the gap between the words on the page of the Fifth Amendment and the Takings Clause and the Supreme Court's current interpretation of the Takings Clause. And Professor Michelman says, well, you have to understand the constitutional interpretation is like a river. It can move slowly, as long as it moves slowly enough in interpretive paths, wherever it ends up, that's fine. But that's pretty much an elite exercise of following the path of the river instead of just reading the words on the page. So let's put it this way. The Constitution, the basics of the public justification of justice as fairness, should be broadly accessible, and I think we should pay a lot more attention to that step. Then as we follow the path of the river through things like constitutional interpretation, then it would be helpful if those of us who think that public justification can run out can say, there's where we no longer have to obey those strictures.
Thanks.
Rainer Forst?
Thanks. Can I only ask one question, or can I do two?
Well, that depends on your effort, I think.
Okay,
As
so
we've
that
established.
already was a question, and I apologize. That's such a mean guy. Great papers. Leif, how much weight can psychological considerations of resentment play in a deontological account of justice? Because on the one hand, you argue, and I think you bring out the Rousseauian characteristics out clearly, that meritocracy can lead to resentment. But you didn't talk about all the resentment that realizing the difference principle could lead to. And so is it, what kind of a psychology is that? It sounds like a psychology that's guided by certain reasonable assumptions. Whereas the resentment that social equality policies breed would count as completely unjustified, unreasonable resentment. So is there really a psychology here that carries a weight in the argument? And then if I may, Kenzie, lots of things that you presented sounded extremely Lutheran to me. For a Lutheran, you do need moral freedom because good acts are an imperative, but the moral acts don't lead to any merit, reward, or redemption. Luther famously said morality has to be acted on umsonst, for nothing, right? And so I wonder why you didn't stress the Lutheran character of this more, which then also leads, of course, to a Kantian account of morality. But there were lots of quotes where Rawls distances himself from Luther, so I was wondering about the Lutheran character of these arguments.
Leif, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks so much for bringing up the word consequentialist. I think Rawls is much more consequentialist than is oftenly thought.
I didn't use that word. I said deontological.
Is that right? Somehow I heard that other word. So Rawls says that any theory that doesn't take consequences into account is mad. And since I've said the word consequentialist, let me note that right at the beginning of Law of Peoples, Rawls says there's two ideas that guide this book. One is that the great evils of human history arise from domestic injustices, and the second is that once domestic injustices disappear and all societies are liberal or decent, the great evils of human history will no longer occur. So there is a strong element of non-strictly deontological reasoning in Rawls. And about resentment in particular, the question is, does your model of the just and good society have excessive resentment built into it? And that's what I was trying to bring out, that the meritocratic model does seem to have this latent potential for excessive resentment built into it, and Rawls's model doesn't. So there's not this eruption of envy in the Rawlsian model. Now, you're absolutely right that there could be hard feelings in the transition to Rawlsian, well-ordered society, and that just can't be avoided. So that's a separate question, which is a question of politics about how to manage.
On the Luther point, yeah, I would say that you're completely right on the Lutheran theology. It's a very specific contingent circumstance in terms of what Rawls is saying. Like, he's really, in most of those stories, sort of saying Luther and Calvin, right? And there's and one of the things I think is really interesting about this is part of the reason for that is that so much of this is coming to him through Maritain, which we didn't previously know. And for Maritain, because he's a Catholic philosopher, there's a good reason to kind of say, here's how the Protestants get it wrong, right? Like, and to say Luther and Calvin. And that is like, and Rawls is reading True Humanism, and he's like thinking this through. And also, he's at, to the extent that he's interacting with like Reformed Christianity in person at Princeton, you've got a Presbyterian foundation. So he's not rubbing for the non-Episcopalians he's rubbing shoulders with, they're Presbyterians, not Lutherans. And so I don't think he's being confronted so much by the Lutheran who would say, well, hang on, I think I pretty much agree with everything you just said, right? So there's something very stylized about this, and stylized in a particular way. Yeah, and so I think it's a fair point. But
so he was a Lutheran without knowing it.
Well, he would say he was an Episcopalian, and the Episcopalians and Lutherans are in communion, so it's maybe not surprising that that there's some similarity there. But it's interesting to me both how the story brings out the ways in which these denominational distinctions are really important and the ways in which they cross, right? Because here you are at like very not Catholic Princeton, but Maritain showed up, and he's and there's a whole bunch of reasons why people are feeling like, oh, we're all kind of traveling along the same lane here. Has a lot to do with the war. And so it's interesting. Just I think the denominational identities we want to be very attentive to, but also not in a way that makes us think like, oh, people are only talking inside of those traditions.
Yes.
And Paul Weithman, Notre Dame. I have two questions for Kenzie. One is that I'm really struck by, on the one hand, the deep engagement of the young Rawls with Maritain, and on the other hand, with what Rawls says just a year later in the thesis about Maritain's primary intellectual influence. As I remember, he just mentions Thomas Aquinas briefly, lumps him with Augustine as a proponent of naturalist Christianity. That's very surprising, given the engagement with Maritain you've described. So my first question is, what do you make of it?
Yep.
The second question is this. There seems to be a vast difference, we might think, between the young Rawls who makes grace so important and the philosophical Rawls we all know, for whom humanity seems to be naturally good, right, in at least one sense. So we might think that there's a huge difference there. But I wonder, as I remember the thesis, and this I think came out in your answer to Michael Rosen too, there isn't a sense of human depravity. There isn't a sense of the need for sanctifying grace. It isn't exactly clear to me what grace is needed for. And if you don't really need it, then it's easy for it to fade away. And you might think, if that's true, that the distance between the earlier Rawls and the later one is narrowed quite considerably. And I guess this bears on the last point that you made in the paper, which was, as I recall, that it's very hard to secularize a theory to which grace is central. But if there's grace, then there's grace. And grace isn't really needed. It's not clear why grace is needed. Then the theory becomes much easier to secularize. It's much easier to think your way into a theory according to which human beings are naturally good after all and don't really need it.
Yeah, thank you. On the Maritain point, yeah, it's really interesting. I've written something longer about all this and about how, why is it that he's so engaged with Maritain in this essay, and then it's glancing in the thesis, and it, and sort of more separate. I'm pretty sure what happened was he took this class in the summer, that summer of 1942, with E. Harris Harbison, who was like a very Protestant historian of the Protestant Reformation, like very Protestant. And he taught Rawls sort of European intellectual history, with the theme being that like the problem with European intellectual history was that there had been like a series of theories about closed groups where like people are inside the pale and they're good, and everybody outside the pale is like a heretic. And Harbison starts that story with the Catholic Church and runs it to the Nazis. Like, that's literally his story. And you will see that story cited in the senior thesis. It appears with a citation to Harbison, and it just says, oh, thanks to Professor Harbison for this. If you go look at his transcript, you find out he's taking this summer class. And so I think what happens is that this article is published in spring of 1942. Then he takes this class with this really Protestant professor who sort of like reinforces, does that kind of disciplinary thing of saying like, we're Protestants here, right? And the Catholics like are part of the problem over here. And so I think actually it causes Rawls to back away from using and citing Maritain in the kind of sympathetic way that he does. But it doesn't cause him to shift the arguments that he's making. It's just that he goes and finds other people to connect them to. So I'm pretty sure that's what's going on, is it's denominational policing, which again is why it's important for us to have these denominational things in mind, even though the way they're playing out is complicated. In terms of the second question about what grace is doing, I think that I would really, for folks who are interested in this, I would definitely commend RAWLS'S account of conversion that's in the senior thesis. I think that Rawls thinks that the way that we live with freedom after grace has to be activated by a profound sense of thankfulness. And I think he thinks that we are so tied up in ourselves that the only way to get there is with a certain kind of like blasting apart of this sense of self-sufficiency. And I think he thinks that he thinks the process of conversion. And so in that sense, he has a little bit of space for what we might call like human depravity, in that he thinks you kind of have to be like, yourself has to be blasted open enough for you to then feel like profoundly thankful for the fact that, he has this account where, you're blasted open, you really should fall apart, and then somehow you find that you don't fall apart because God like sustains you, and then you're like, oh wow, all of me is God's, and like, and so I think, so I guess that would be the kind of the spirit that I think he needs. And it gets maybe even to this question about like resentment and legitimate envy and stuff. Like, I think the original Rawls, and we can have a whole discussion, and you would be very qualified to do it, about where we go in political liberalism. But I think our theory of justice, Rawls, really like thinks that the kinds of people who he imagines growing up in these just societies really don't resent people who get something because of the difference principle, and it's because they're sufficiently like thankful in attitude about the world in certain way, like that they truly recognize it could have been me, like that we're in relationship together, right? And that's part of what's going on. So I guess I would say I'm not convinced that we can say the grace was never that real and so we can sweep it away, because I think he's using it to have a profound turning moment happen in someone's heart, and I'm not sure that it's obvious that there's a mechanism for that.
Well, with apologies to those who didn't get a chance to ask the question, I think we have to wrap up and thank our panelists for a terrific opening discussion.